Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today grew up between Sacramento grit and the glow of Hollywood. She's the daughter of actor Tom Hanks, but her story is very much her own. A journalist turned memoirist, she's written for Vanity Fair, The Guardian and The New York Times. Her debut, The 10, is a literary road trip into family, history and the landscapes that shaped her. E.A. Hanks, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So you publish as E.A. Hanks, though you were born Elizabeth Ann. So I wonder what E.A. gives you that Elizabeth doesn't. Is it distance, protection, or just rhythm on the page?
It covers a multitude of needs. E.A. came from my time working at the Huffington Post, which I started off as a secondary reporter at Vanity Fair, mostly doing research for staff writers. And from there, after a number of years, I became one of the editors of the front page at the Huffington Post, and then sort of became a Jane about town. I worked on a number of, as we called them, verticals at the time. And
what's a vertical?
A vertical was, a section, sort of the living section, the sports section, the front news section, the blog section, all of these sorts of things. So I moved around a little bit, and I made a point. I had a wonderful editor who was sort of took me on as a mentee, and his name was Francis Wilkinson, and he had come from the editorial page of the New York Times. And he said, you cannot underestimate this opportunity. Try to have a piece up every week. Find something to say about the state of the world and say it as best you can once a week. And that introduced me to what anybody who works in the public forum comes to know very well, which is the comment section. No. And as I recently said to Christiane Amanpour, I don't know if you know this, Christiane, but men don't particularly like it when you try to explain politics and or the world to them. So it was a lesson in don't read the comment section, which I'm very good at. Yeah. And also, it was a little bit of trickery because I passed as a sort of anonymous voice commenting on the state of the world. And then also there was a slightly Machiavellian aspect, which is because I have a very famous last name, if someone was trying to Google me to read me, back at a time when Google was actually good at finding things on the internet, if you Googled Elizabeth Hanks, what you would get was about 5 pages about the film Big, because search engine optimization would just find the Elizabeth and Elizabeth Perkins and the Hanks and Tom Hanks. So if I wanted to crack into sort of the zeitgeist, I needed to kind of get, I had to invest in subterfuge. So EA, that is how that began. But now that I have entered the public sphere and given up what sort of anonymity I had, I find that it also lends itself to a healthy level of compartmentalization. When I'm working, I'm EA, and when I'm not, I'm the other person.
Yeah. And is the other person Elizabeth Ann, Elizabeth, Liz, Lizzie?
Oh boy, we've struck onto a hot topic in my friend group, which is at some point I fessed up that I actually do not care for the name Liz. I prefer Elizabeth, but it is baked into my friend group that I'm Liz. And I tried to correct everyone for about a year before I finally decided to get a little flexible and say, all right, if you've known me since the 90s, you get to still call me Liz, and everybody else thereafter, I prefer Elizabeth. Yeah,
that's so. I have exactly the same thing with a name that can be shortened. So to some people, I'm always Georgina. Yeah. If they've known me forever, they can call me George. It's
these classic kind of Anglophilic names. They're burdened with a bevy of nickname possibilities. You could really go anywhere. I tried Lizzie when I went off to university, and immediately discovered that I'd reached way too far. I'd really shot for the moon on that one. And my friend group just said, yeah, no, sorry, no, you're Liz. Sorry. Nice try, but no. So, yeah.
I'm going to call you Elizabeth.
I would appreciate it very much. What would you like to be known as?
You can just call me George.
George, all right. I prefer.
We're going to be friends, I can tell.
Perfect. Elizabeth and George.
All right. So maybe we should properly start the interview now. Shall I? I'm going to ask you about where you were born, because that's how I always ask.
Yeah.
So you were born in Burbank,
yes,
in California. Now, tell me about this, because basically your parents came together, and your mother it sort of later tells you that basically she was kind of cutting your dad a break, giving this young actor a shot at someone like her.
Yeah. So my parents met in the theater department at Sacramento State University. And my mom kind of fancied herself the reigning queen of the theater department. And she was, with the theater kids, not the sort of jazz hands always looking for the spotlight theater kids, but like always wearing black and arguing about Stanislavski and smoking and, that brand of theater kid. And my dad was someone who was just happy to be there. And unlike my mom, my dad had already shown signs of immense talent. And that meant that instantly I was sort of fascinated by their coming together, because my mom had her version of the story was that she was sort of, like a Vivian Lee sort of dame of artistry, and that my dad was this kind of goofball with hair like a metal plate scrubber and talented, but he got lucky. And that's the version of their coming together that I knew. I come into the picture once my dad has already had a child, my older brother Colin. They lived in New York for a while my dad was shooting a short-lived television show called Bosom Buddies. I kind of come in right at the cusp of his career beginning to gain some momentum. So I'm born in 1982 in Burbank, California, which for international listeners is a very sort of showbiz enclave. It's a suburb. It's a valley town. It's where the Disney studios are, and it's where the sun kind of bakes on wider lane streets than in the other side of the mountains. So it's where the majority working class people who make television shows and make breakfast burritos on the sets of movies live and raise their kids. So that's where I was born. And
as you say, your father, and I really don't want this interview to be about your father, but this is relevant.
We can send him a little love. He could use it. He's getting up there.
He was just beginning to kind of break through at this time, and really it seems like it was, or certainly my reading of the book seems like his success was kind of what contributed to the breakdown of their marriage.
I wouldn't co-sign on that. I mean, the way that I describe his ascendant fame and how it felt to my mother, and I think on some level, now that the book has come out, and I've had this conversation with him, the term I describe it or use to describe it is cataclysmic fame. And what is a cataclysm? A cataclysm is the eradication of something. Their marriage was never built on anything other than sand. That marriage had already started to fall apart, in large part because of my mom's declining mental health, her significant substance abuse issues. And I think that his ascendancy in the industry and in his career, because I always like to say, I'm going to confuse people with a sports metaphor because I'm not really a sports girl. But I would say that we were not born on third base, but we did move there in the 90s, and kind of before that whirlwind began, that marriage was already in a very, very rocky place. And as I describe in the book, I once asked my dad if I was a sort of save the marriage baby, and his answer was completely honest. He said, "No, you weren't, but you were a someone died, and I feel the urge to create life, baby." And the person who had passed was the malevolent figure of my book, my grandfather, John Raymond Dillingham, who my mother never, ever spoke of. So his fame did not split them up. That was, there was no universe where they were going to stay together. And I remembered being sort of fascinated by films in my youth, like The Parent Trap, where kids, schemed to get their separated parents back together. That was never a fantasy that I had, even as a young child. Even as a kid, I kind of understood that that it was best for everyone involved that they weren't married to each other.
So you were 5. Your mum takes you and your brother Colin to Sacramento, which you have. I mean, you describe a fridge often bare or full of expired food, a backyard you couldn't play in, a woman clearly who is not coping.
Yeah.
Describe to me, take us back to the house, what it smelt like, what it felt like to live there, and to feel, I mean, you've described it as like you're on thin ice. You were never sure what was going to happen or how she would react to anything.
Yeah, it's... I love this question because, honestly, I have very vivid dreams, and I would say 9 times out of 10 what I dream about is the house I grew up in. Still, to this day, I had one the other night. So I grew up on a house, in a house that from the outside was the house of a privileged and happy family. And we were privileged, but we were not happy. There were moments of joy, as there always is in dark circumstances. But the house smelled of cigarette smoke. It smelled of animal feces and urine. It smelled of old coffee grinds and mildew. And it was this house that it wasn't quite Grey Gardens-esque. You know, I wasn't feeding pâté to the cats as raccoons came through the roof. But there was an aspect of Big and Little Edie kind of toddling around this house that was kind of a grand old lady but had fallen perhaps into the wrong hands. So it had all the markers of stability. There was a pool. Who's so lucky to grow up with a pool in their backyard? And there was, columns and rose bushes. And, over the years, suddenly over the windows, there was, metal bars as if we lived in an endangered neighborhood. And there were security cameras as if we were holding gold bars. And there was a Y2K panic room with an apocalypse food hoard in the basement as if we were end of days preppers. So it was a very bizarre sort of cognitive dissonance bonanza of what the basis is this is an upper middle class stable family that is living in a extremely desirable neighborhood called the Fabulous 40s, and then what was happening inside was decidedly not fabulous.
I mean, a lot of the media coverage about your book kind of screams headlines. Tom Hanks's daughter alleges huge abuse by her mother, and of course there is an element of abuse here. But I read this book almost as a love letter to her. I think that there is clearly a huge well of deep affection and love for this woman who was so deeply troubled, and she was troubled because of her own background, and really that's what you try and draw out in this journey. She got clean. She hosted 12-step meetings in your living room. So you kind of had a language for addiction very early, but there wasn't really a language for her mental illness. I mean, she would talk to God in public. Did religion replace her other addictions?
I think, yes, it was the superstructure on which she could build her understanding of the world and her coping mechanism. I think, the strength my mother had, my mother who heard the voice of God, who was victimized at a very young age, in my mind, that she was able to take away the one coping mechanism that helped her deal with what had happened to her, which was extensive drug abuse. The fact that she was able to give that up and to become clean and sober, and to the best of my knowledge, never had a significant relapse. Relapse is part of early sobriety, but to the best of my knowledge, she never fell off the wagon once she was on it. Yes, she hosted all of them. Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addiction and Love Addiction Anonymous. And rather than get me a babysitter, as perhaps one would do, she would bring me along. And I've read the Big Blue Book. I have, and as an adult, I've been to Al-Anon meetings. You're exactly right. I had a language to understand addiction, but I did not understand why. The example I give in the book, the depths of my mother's evangelical fever, was that I once asked her as a child, why is the date 1066 so important. And rather than say, well, that's the Battle of Hastings when the Norman invasion began, she said, well, when people don't have a love of Jesus in their heart and they haven't been washed in the blood of the Lamb, ... So I don't think if you've ever been around that sort of, I don't even know what, fervor is not a strong enough
fanaticism?
word. Yeah, fanaticism is really more accurate. I don't think you can understand what amongst anything else, it's a massive impediment to intimacy because you can't get through that language. That language is kind of textbook in a way. I imagine it's like akin to trying to talk to a Soviet apparatchik about, George Orwell. It's like you're never going to get through the ideology. You're never going to get through the coping mechanisms or the language tools. So it meant that my mom's primary relationship was always with her Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Really difficult. I mean, you and the words you use, you talk about her reality as fluid, her truth fed through the meat grinder of mental illness. I mean, just lots of lovely, lovely imagery here, although very frightening and very scary for a child. What was it then that finally tipped you to the point where you thought, I cannot deal with this and I am going to go and live with my father?
Yeah. There had been sort of, you only know the aquarium you're swimming around in, and you don't notice the water or its cleanliness or its. I've talked myself into a literal box with this aquarium analogy. I don't know what else goes into it. The pH balance of the water. But as I got older, and the more I recognized that my elder brother was having to go elsewhere for the basics of life, clean clothes, food, friendship, stability, help with homework, all of these things. The more I recognized what was lacking in our home, the more I protected my mother and tried to defend her against sort of odd stares, whispered conversations in public. But I could not hold off the truth, and it became more and more difficult to sort of pretend that there was nothing off, especially as you get older and as my mother started collecting guns. And I had I had one group of friends for whom my mom was the cool mom because she would let us eat cookie dough for dinner at sleepovers and she would let me dye my hair whatever color I wanted. I had an entire other group of people who were not allowed to come to my house. And that gets more and more evident as you get older and you're more and more aware of your surroundings. And there had been an increasing level of physical threat. My mom had been verbally abusive. She often told me that my soul was in peril and I was going to go to hell. She told me that I was responsible for my unborn siblings who did not exist, that I was somehow ultimately responsible for her myriad miscarriages, on and on and on. And there had been physical intimidation, there had been pushing, there had been hair pulling, there had been locking into rooms, there had been spanking, which I know is a very controversial topic in parental groups as to whether or not that counts as abuse. My personal experience of it is that it does. But she had never just hauled off and started, punching, hitting. And one night that changed. And I have a very clear memory of watching her sort of barrel across the room at me in one of those nights that had just, I could not tell what had set her off. Just the whole day had been one of those like, oop, this is a day where no one watches television downstairs. No one comes out of their room asking what's for dinner. This is a day where you keep your head down low. And that wasn't enough to save me that night. And she came in, and as she was coming at me, I just have this very clear memory of everything else I can explain away. But I know that a parent is not supposed to strike a child, especially not across the face. And I thought, if she hits me, I have to leave. And she did, so I did. And I was then empowered by the sort of family law of the time, which required, receipt of physical abuse. and very clear, direct physical abuse. And so once I could call my dad and say, well, the Rubicon has been crossed, a sort of machine went into action to get me out. And that is how I ended up switching custody between my parents.
And how was that, coming from this life of utter chaos into calm, but also into a household that obviously is of great interest to a lot of people?
Yeah. I would not say it was a transition into calm, but it was a transition into stability. My stepmother, who's been married to my dad since I was almost, I can't remember a time where she wasn't, as I say, my other mother, and my two younger brothers, one of whom was 5, the other one had just been born, so there was a newborn in the house. My dad was in the middle of directing his first feature film, That Thing You Do, which was kicking his ass and everybody else around him. So it was not calm. It was extremely fraught. And on top of that, an actor at the level of my dad's stature, his home is like it's a production company. And so I went from being essentially alone 80% of my time to having 2 younger brothers, a father, a mother figure, her parents, my grandparents who were helping raise my younger brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, assistants, people dropping off checks to sign. I mean, it was like moving from the great empty sort of void of the moors to living in Paddington Station. I mean, it was the upside down. And I was completely lost in it. I mean, even though I had been visiting that world on the weekends and during the summers per our custody arrangement, suddenly living there was sort of like kind of moving into a hotel that happened to have pictures of me on the wall. I had no intimacy with the space. And so suddenly being like, oh, this is my bedroom. This is my closet. These are, I had the bizarre wardrobe of somebody who's only there 2 days a month. And suddenly this is my childhood bedroom. It was a transition of realities that took a very long time to kind of even out.
Yeah. You still had contact with your mother, and one of the things that you did together was to take this road trip. Now, she describes herself as a Southern girl, and her roots were Southern. You describe her life as touched by Southern Gothic drama and violence. And you, after her death, you finally get some notebooks which tell you a little bit more about this. But tell us about that initial trip with her and what you were kind of gleaming about her family and where you went and the route, because, of course, the route is largely the 10 of the title of your book.
Yes. So it was the summer after I had moved to Los Angeles, and I had moved to Los Angeles in the middle of the academic school year. It was February, I was on the verge of turning 14, and when I moved to Los Angeles, right when sort of, because, nothing's better than being a 13-year-old girl and changing schools, and I was traumatized and confused and just consumed with guilt for abandoning my mother, which anybody who was in relationship with her felt when we eventually leave, because we all did eventually have to leave. When I started visiting her on the weekends, like I used to visit my father on the weekends, she refused to speak to me. She would always have some new sort of person hanging around that was, refitting the cabinets in the kitchen, but then also sleeping on our sofa, or a security guard who suddenly showed up with a German Shepherd and 2, completely ready to go shotguns because she was convinced that someone was breaking into the house. And so we were never really alone, and we never really spoke to each other. And then she announced that she had bought a small Winnebago, a kind of recreational vehicle, and that we were going to drive across the country to visit her mother, my grandmother Harriet, in the small Florida town of Palatka. And then from there, we were going to continue up to Atlanta for the Atlanta Olympics. So this is 1996. So we move essentially into this kind of small boat that we drove along Interstate 10, which is the southernmost transcontinental interstate, which goes through from the Pacific to the Atlantic through California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And we did it in a haze of speed. There was no stopping to see the Grand Canyon. There was no eating at a restaurant in New Orleans. She drove all day, smoking and not talking to me except to ask me for coffee. And then we would crash at some campsite at 11:30 at night, and I would set up the propane and the water system and what's fondly known as the poop chute. And she would sleep until, 11:30 the next day, and then we'd do it all again in silence. And when we finally got to Florida, I had known my grandmother because she had lived in Sacramento. That is how and why we ended up in Sacramento, my brother and I. But my grandmother eventually could not live in the same city as my mother, and she returned to the town of her birth. And as I would go on to find out, about 4 generations of my family have lived in this small town. And it was there where I saw a picture of my grandfather for the first time, a picture of my great-grandmother. It was just this cast of characters who I had never seen. I had never seen anybody that looked like me or had freckles like me or had auburn hair or listened to classical radio constantly on the radio. It was really my first time kind of being around family that I had, frankly, anything at all in common with. And any question I asked about who is this or where did they come from was met with essentially a very Southern sort of polite refusal to discuss all that.
And all that, it transpires, might have included cannibalism.
When my mother died, when I was in college, basically my brother and I were just absolutely exhausted by the process of my mother's death and burying her, and all the logistics that go into handling the bureaucracy of death, as anybody who's buried a loved one knows, because it's exactly what you want to do. I mean, there's an incredibly perverse irony of dealing with the to-do list of death, because at the time you're thinking, how is it that at the worst possible time you're asking me to fill out forms and talk to the credit card company and put the house up for sale and drop things off at Goodwill? And then about 3 months later, when all of that is done, you realize with horror, all you want to do is to be given a to-do list to take your mind off this incredible pain that you're in. Just give me some errands to run, for God's sakes, otherwise I'm going to go mad. I had put all of this stuff, and in that sort of, I can't tell if it's a little dark-sided, but I had a sort of journalistic instinct to take all of these papers and just put them away, because maybe there'd be something in there that would be of interest to me as a daughter or as a writer. And in the way that happens, I blinked and nearly a decade went by. And when I finally went through them, I found 2 sort of texts. One was this white binder of her poetry, which I knew she had written but had never read. And I likened reading that. I likened it to sort of studying the Talmud. It's a text that is rich with metaphor and analogy and imagery that is sometimes madness and sometimes has great beauty. And then there's this other notebook, which is the red notebook. And that is more akin to trying to divine the meaning from the Tao Te Ching. It's vague and beautiful and ominous. And so when I finally go through it, I'm reading it, and it's shopping lists, it's prayers, it's notes to God, it's phone numbers for a locksmith. And then in the midst of it, she describes witnessing her father raping, murdering, and, as I would go on to recall, cannibalizing a little girl. And as you described earlier, I talk about my mom's mental illness where reality goes through a meat grinder. But the strange thing about my mom is there was always a grain of truth. There was always something that kind of gave her permission to to say these extraordinary things because it wasn't wholly fabricated. So you could kind of say, well, that's just Susan's version of events. And I immediately thought, what, if anything, about this is true? Is there more than a grain of truth in this? Because as someone who has been in significant therapy for 20 years at this point to deal with all that we have discussed thus far, I knew that there had to be a galvanizing incident in my mother's life that set her off on this course. How could everyone who knew her intimate to me as both a child and as an adolescent and as I increasingly approached adulthood, that my mother never stood a chance? Why is that? And the answer cannot just be, well, she's from the South. First of all, I didn't even know that she was from the South. That was not a fact to me. It was a possibility. And so I immediately realized that if this wasn't a map to what had happened to my mother, it was an invitation to re-examine the sort of hints and shadows and gestures of a history that I had for her. Because I didn't even know where she was born. I didn't know where she went to high school. I didn't know that if she had friends. I didn't know what her relationship with her brothers was like. And so, yada, 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 in 2019, I decided to figure out what's the deal with this journal.
And so you get on the road
Yes.
In this little van, which you fill with books and all sorts of things. I love the day-to-day descriptions of like what you were doing. You talk about, for instance, you say strip malls are an insult to the land, and you say they drown out its hymn, which I thought was a very beautiful way of putting it. I wondered what the land itself taught you when you let it speak, because we get into nature, but we get almost into the heart of America.
I'm glad that's there. I'm glad that's there because, this book originally was conceived as a magazine article, no going there. And then it was a podcast, almost, but didn't quite get there. And everybody just kind of kept saying, well, you have these two facets of the story you want to tell, the macro and the micro. And we really only want the micro. We just want you and your mom and your famous dad. And we're not really interested in anything else. And I said, but my mom and me and my dad, we're only possible in America. And I think I was intensely invested in trying to explain to myself and to readers that I think the stories that we tell about ourselves are intrinsically tied to the stories we tell about the places that we're from. And I think all places are built on a story, a narrative of identity. But it seemed to me that the 10 was this artery through these landscapes that are so integral to the story that America tells about itself, about American exceptionalism, about bootstrap mentality, about the gallant South, about manifest destiny, and that there was no way to interrogate my mom's story about who she was without addressing also the story she told about the South. And for that matter, I knew that Arizona is different than Louisiana, but how is Arizona different than New Mexico? How is Phoenix different than Tucson, if at all? They're very different, by the way, listeners. And for whom do those differences matter? And do they matter at all? And who knows a place best?
And you have to learn, as you wrote, to look with soft eyes.
Yeah.
And I just love those descriptions of the desert. I could feel that I was in there, and it made me yearn for it. But and the whole journey goes through this. So you go from the intense heat and the dryness to the lushness. You're going from dry to wet. It's beautifully, beautifully done. And at one point, you actually get off the 10 and you make a detour, and this really struck me because I also had a profound experience in this place. You go to Montgomery.
Oh yeah, you've been.
I have.
Oh,
the most
wow.
extraordinary place, and it just makes you think about everything. And I wonder how, if you could tell our listeners what's there, but then what it made you feel and how it made you interrogate your own family.
So we're talking about Montgomery, Alabama, which is the site of the Equal Justice Initiative's colloquially known, I butcher that word every time. Let's go with this. It's generally known as the lynching memorial. And it's multiple sites. There's the memorial itself, and then there's a museum. And the memorial itself is a sort of built art piece that commemorates all of the names of lynched persons in the height of Jim Crow and the reign of terror that the KKK. It's the timing of this conversation is weighing on my heart.
We're speaking just a couple of days after Charlie Kirk was shot dead.
Yeah, and which historically black colleges and universities all across America have had to shut down because they've been so threatened with violence. Historically, black colleges and universities were founded so that students could evade the long shadow of Jim Crow and the KKK. The Equal Justice Initiative essentially has been this profound research experience of trying to name all of the people who have been lynched in racial murder and terrorism, which is a very hard thing to do because a lot of people were murdered in racial violence by being lynched. And, you know, in a time when we're talking about how easily accessible extremely violent imagery is, I'd like to remind listeners they used to make postcards of lynchings. They were wildly popular. Look, wish you were here. And they were sold everywhere. So I veer off the 10 and I go to Montgomery because I realize that I have a degree of homework, a strange combination of homework and penance to do, because on the 10, when I leave New Orleans, I go to a place called Beauvoir, which is outside Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Beauvoir is the quote-unquote presidential home and library of Jefferson Davis, the so-called president of the Confederacy. And being white and ignorant, I thought I was going to a museum that would place the Confederacy and the Civil War, and for that matter, slavery, in a responsible historical context. That is not what Beauvoir offers its visitors. Beauvoir offers what the Southern Poverty Law Center and the NAACP will all tell you is a racist fantasy that the Civil War was about states' rights. The right to own, enslave, rape, and murder other human beings that were sold as chattel for the economic development of America's industrial complex. And the reality of what I was confronted with and my deep shame at being surprised sent me to Montgomery because I wanted to discover the reality of what Beauvoir was. And what I found out was there was a sort of, in the reckoning, the short-lived, I might add, reckoning after George Floyd's death, was a conversation about Confederate statues and monuments, all of which, by the way, take taxpayer dollars and are funded by the federal government. Beauvoir wants them all. If they were taken down, they want them. They want to put them up because it, according to them, is history that should be recognized as part of the culture of the Confederacy. The fact is, none of those statues were built during the Confederacy. They were built in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s in the era of deep segregation in the South and of Jim Crow. And they provided a permission structure for racial terrorism in lynching. So I wanted to go to Montgomery and to the lynching memorial to find out what really happened near Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And I fought very hard for the list of names that appears in the 10 to be there because the book is what I saw and thought about on the trip. And that is what I saw. And that is what I'm still thinking about from my trip.
you connect with people along the way. There are these wonderful little vignettes of all these different people that you meet, and you kind of say to know a place, you have to know the people. And some places you stay longer and some places you just pass through. One of the places you end up in for quite a long time is New Orleans, which you say Nora Ephron said to you was not even America. And I just need you to digress here because Heartburn is my favourite book in the universe.
Oh, God. Have you made the carbonara? Have you made the pasta recipe?
I've made everything in Nora Ephron's book, including Egg for One.
Oh.
That was just so sad. But listen, you've just got to tell me about Nora.
Listen, if you're going to drop a name.
Yeah.
And I am so privileged as to be able to drop this name and this anecdote. I tell a story about how I was living in New York, blessed to share the same, general geographic area as American icon and national treasure, Nora Ephron. But New York and I were in a rocky period. It wasn't going well. And I had decided, because I had dear friends who are both from New Orleans and had moved to New Orleans after the storm, after Katrina, that I was ready for a new adventure, and I thought New Orleans might be the place. And Nora, I was very lucky to kind of be on her radar from a young age, and she was always kind of asking me what I was doing and where I was going. And for that part, accusations of nepotism are entirely accurate, but they're just pointed in the wrong direction. Nora got me my job at Vanity Fair, and it was Nora who told me, "Okay, you've been at Vanity Fair too long. Now it's time for you to move on." And she recommended me to Ariane Huffington at the Huffington Post. So she kept track of me. I can say
she used to help you with your homework.
She read some of my papers and would say, like, well, that's a little flowery. It was not a consistent thing. It was a one-time remarkable thing that I'll, clutch to my heart on my deathbed. But she was saying, like, your father says you're leaving New York. And I would say, yeah, I think I am. And she said, oh, God, why? You'll have to live in America. And I said, no, actually, I'm going to move to New Orleans. And she said, oh, yeah, no, that is not America.
Fantastic.
You will get so fat and you will be very happy. And I thought, that is right. Sign me up for that praline bacon at Elizabeth's in the Bywater. Like, get me there as quickly as possible. I was, in the end, rerouted by imminent aunthood, but I still like that praline bacon.
Listen, the book is extraordinary. It's got a mission at its heart, and it's a mission that you fulfill in lots of ways in terms of interrogating yourself and discovering the country. But you don't ultimately get to the heart of your grandfather, for instance. But I think you possibly get to understand your mother more. I mean, it doesn't end with a neat resolution.
It does not have a crime podcast tidy ending, no.
Yeah. So I guess I just want to know what it did for you.
This book from conception to publication, oddly enough, took 10 years. It really is my 30s encapsulated. And a dear friend of mine said when she got to read it, what's so odd about it is that your partner isn't in it. I live with someone now, my partner for life, and the fact that I look at this book now and it is a sort of remnant and Valentine from a time in my life where I really thought I was going to be alone. And I was okay with that because, as I say in the book, traveling requires time. And as a single person, I am rich with hours to myself. And the mission that it gave me, that I don't think I really know America. I think the color of my skin means I know America, an America, a version of America. And I don't think that image I have in my head is facile enough to survive reality. And getting in the van and trying to look at my personal history and my country's history as not a narrative, but a series of dispassionate facts, means that I was able to get to a place not of forgiveness, but of grace with both who my mother was and who my country is. Mm. And that means that I have a level of flexibility and understanding that never eradicates the deep hurt or the deep disappointment or the sense that I deserved better and that we deserve better. But I think what it gave me was a process of interrogation born of optimistic curiosity that allows me to engage safely with both the best of us and the worst of us, and the best of my mother and the worst of my mother, and frankly, the best of me and the worst of me. It made me truly grateful for the ability to ask questions and the courage to hear the answers.
Elizabeth, before we go, who's your first reader?
For this specifically or for anything?
Generally.
Generally.
Or maybe, no, let's say for this specific.
Yeah, I have to say it was my father and my brother Colin, because frankly, from a just meat and potatoes perspective, madness is very hard to capture well without it turning into cartoon. I did not want my mom to come off as Miss Havisham. I did not want her to come off as just a, batty schizoid. I wanted her to have depth and to show the totality of her, but I also wanted it to be accurate. And there's only so many people who remember my mom and could be that barometer for me. So the first people to read it were my dad and my brother. And my dad said two things. He said, that is exactly what it was like to love and leave your mother. And he said, that's a Bruce Springsteen song. Which I don't think can get, if it wanted, talk about courting criticisms of nepotism, if I could, I'd put that on the cover. but I'll have to just keep it in my memory. And frankly, my brother and I are the only two veterans of a very small war. And to have not only his grace for me and my need to tell my experience of that war, and to have his reminders of the nuances of who my mom was. Because it's been 20 years since she passed. I would not recommend that anyone in grief start writing about their dead, complicated mom, 6 months after the fact. Wait a minute. The book will only be better for waiting a little while. And so he was able to come to a very soft and vulnerable space to talk to me about things we had not discussed in some time. And I'm dearly grateful to both of them. And I have to say that since the book has come out, I have heard from people who knew my mom as a college student, as a young woman, and their recollections mean the world to me because it just continues to flesh out this woman who is both the woman I know better than I know myself, just as she knew me better than I knew myself, and yet will always be a mystery, as I think all daughters and mothers are to each other.
Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. What a lovely time.
The 10, a memoir of family and the open road by E.A. Hanks, is published in the UK by Simon & Schuster. It's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.